Again, the Senate in a quorum call after having blocked an amendment to extend unemployment.
I come to the floor this early evening.
Excuse me, Senate is in quorum call.
I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor this evening to discuss an issue of national security, and that is how to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. I was thinking about our troubled history with Iran and whether more sanctions at this time make sense for our national security interests. And I asked these questions of myself. Can, in fact, a country like Iran change? Is it possible for an isolated regime to rejoin the community of nations and change its behavior after several decades? Must a country and its people be held captive because of the behavior of previous leaders in earlier times? So I thought back on history. I was a young girl during World War II. I remember when Imperial Japan killed millions in Southeast Asia, and particularly China, during its brutal wars of expansion. Today, Japan is a peaceful democracy and one of this nation's strongest allies in Asia. I remember when Hitler and the German Third Reich committed unspeakable atrocities across Europe, including the murder of 6 million Jewish citizens. Germany is now a close ally, a leader in the European Union, an institution created to ensure a war never again occurs in Europe. I remember General Franco's Spain, which was so diplomatically and economically isolated that it was actually barred from the United Nations until 1955. Spain is now a close partner of the United States and a fully democratic member of the European Union. The former Yugoslavia, Vietnam, and South Africa have all experienced tremendous change in recent decades. Independent states have emerged from the painful dissolution of Yugoslavia. Vietnam has opened itself to the international community, but still has much progress to make. And South Africa has shed apartheid and has emerged as an increasingly stable nation on a much divided continent. So I believe countries can change. This capacity to change also applies to the pursuit of nuclear weapons. At one time, Sweden, South Korea, and Argentina each pursued nuclear weapons. Following World War II, Sweden pursued nuclear weapons to deter foreign attack. It mastered nuclear technology and built and tested components for a nuclear weapon. It may have even obtained enough nuclear material to build a bomb. But in 1970, it signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it ended its nuclear weapon program. In the early 1970s, South Korea actively sought a nuclear device. The United States heavily pressured South Korea not to go nuclear. And in April of 1975, South Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and halted its nuclear weapons activity. Throughout the 1980s, when it was ruled by a military junta with an egregious human rights record, Argentina had a covert nuclear weapons program. It built uranium production, enrichment, and reprocessing facilities, and it attempted to develop nuclear-capable ballistic missiles before abandoning its nuclear weapons program and ratifying the NPT in 1995. So the question comes, is Iran willing to change its past behavior and abandon its pursuit of a nuclear weapon? It may well be, and it's the job of diplomacy to push for that change. I believe there are positive signs that Iran is interested in such a change, and I'd like to explain my reasons. The election of Hassan Rouhani was a surprise to many longtime observers of Iran because he campaigned in support of repairing Iran's relationship with the West. And since his inauguration, he has tried to do exactly that. For the first time since the Iranian Revolution, the leaders of our countries have been in direct communication with each other. Where once direct contact, even between senior officials, were rare, now Secretary of State John Kerry and Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman are in near constant contact with their Iranian counterparts. Those conversations produced the historic Geneva Agreement, which goes into effect in 6 days on January the 20th. Candidate Rouhani also promised to increase nuclear transparency, and he has delivered on that as well. Even before the Geneva Interim Agreement was reached, Iran slowed uranium enrichment and construction for the Arak heavy water reactor. Maybe for technical reasons, maybe not, but it's slowed. Iran has also re-engaged with the IAEA to resolve questions surrounding its nuclear activities. So what has been achieved in Geneva? The interim 6-month agreement reached between the P5+1 countries, and those are big countries, the United States, China, Russia, the UK, France, Germany. This agreement freezes Iran's nuclear program in place, while a comprehensive agreement is negotiated in the next 6 months. This agreement caps Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium at 5%. It stops the production of 20% enriched uranium. It requires the neutralization of Iran's stockpile of 20% uranium. It prevents Iran from installing additional centrifuges or operating its most advanced centrifuges. It prohibits it from stockpiling excess centrifuges. And it halts all significant work at the Arak heavy water reactor and prevents Iran from constructing a plutonium reprocessing facility. Most importantly, the interim agreement imposes the most intrusive international inspection regime ever. International inspectors will independently verify whether or not Iran is complying with the interim agreement. So for the first time, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors will have uninterrupted access to Iran's enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo, centrifuge production plants, centrifuge assembly facilities, and Iran's uranium mines and mills. And finally, Iran is required to declare all planned new nuclear facilities. In exchange, the P5+1 negotiators offered sanctions relief limited to $7 billion, an aspect of the interim agreement that's been criticized, and I want to talk about it for a moment. Here are the facts on that sanctions relief, which in my view does not materially alter the biting sanctions that have devastated Iran's economy. The vast majority of sanctions relief comes in the form of Iranian repatriation of $4.2 billion of its own money. Iran will continue to lose $4 to $5 billion a month in lost oil revenue from existing sanctions. Iran will not have access to about $100 billion of its own reserve trapped by sanctions abroad. For perspective, the total estimated sanctions relief is valued at approximately only 1% of the Iranian economy, hardly a significant amount. I would like to take a moment to detail what's not in the interim agreement. First, it does not enable Iran to a right to enrich. The United States does not recognize such a right for the 5 non-nuclear weapon states that currently have enrichment programs, and we will make no exception for Iran. But Iran does have a right to peaceful nuclear energy if it fully abides by the terms of its safeguards agreement under the NPT. Secondly, the agreement does not in any way unravel our core oil and financial sanctions. Others have argued the suspension of any sanctions against Iran will unravel the entire sanctions regime, and that's false. The Obama administration has taken action to ensure that does not happen. 2 days after the interim agreement was reached, the United States settled with a Swiss oil services company over sanctions violations. The settlement was more than $250 million. It was the largest against a foreign firm outside the banking industry. On December 12th, the administration announced the expansion of Iranian entities subject to sanctions. These entities either helped Tehran evade sanctions or provided support to Iran's nuclear program. On January 7th, the administration halted the transfer of 2 Boeing airplane engines from Turkey to Iran. Through these actions, the Obama administration has made it abundantly clear the United States will continue to enforce our sanctions against Iran. Third, the agreement does not codify the violation of UN security resolutions. Critics have attacked the interim agreement for its failure to completely halt all of Iran's nuclear enrichment by noting that 6 United Nations security resolutions have called on Tehran to do so, and it has not done so. The purpose of the UN resolutions was not to suspend nuclear enrichment indefinitely. Instead, these resolutions were designed to freeze Iran's nuclear activities until the IAEA could determine whether or not Iran's activities were for exclusively peaceful purposes. Now, this is an important point. The interim agreement achieves what the United Nations 6 resolutions could not. It freezes Iran's nuclear progress while a comprehensive, verifiable agreement is being negotiated over the next 6 months. The interim agreement was only possible because a strong international sanctions regime has worked to convince rank-and-file Iranians, candidly, enough is enough. According to the State Department, as a result of these sanctions, Iran's crude oil exports have plummeted from approximately 2.5 million barrels a day in 2011 to around 1 million barrels per day in recent months. And this decline alone costs Iran $3 to $5 billion per month in lost revenue. In total, 23 importers of Iranian oil have eliminated or significantly reduced purchases from Iran. Iran, in fact, currently has only 6 customers for its oil: China, India, Turkey, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. In the last year, Iran's gross domestic product shrunk by 5.8%. Its GDP shrunk in a year by 5.8%, while inflation is estimated to be 50% or more. Prices for food and consumer goods are doubling and tripling on an annual basis, and estimates put unemployment as high as 35%, while underemployment is pervasive. This is why Iran says enough is enough. The sanctions are biting, and they are biting deeply, and there's no need to put additional sanctions on the table at this time. This body may soon consider the Nuclear Weapon-Free Iran Act, and that's a bill to do exactly the opposite, to impose additional sanctions against Iran, do it now, and hold it in abeyance. Before casting a vote, senators should ask themselves, what would happen if the bill passes and a promised veto by the President is not sustained? I'd like to give you my view. I sincerely believe that the P5+1 negotiations with Iran would end, and with it, the best opportunity in more than 30 years to make a major change in Iranian behavior, a change that could not only open all kinds of economic opportunities for the Iranian people, but help change the course of a nation. Its destiny, in fact, could be changed. Passing additional sanctions now would only play into the hands of those in Iran who are most eager to see diplomacy fail. Iranian conservatives, hardliners, will attack President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif for seeking a nuclear compromise. They argue that Iran exchanged a freeze of its nuclear program for additional and harsh punitive sanctions. Think about that. You didn't achieve anything with this agreement. All you got were more sanctions. They're held in abeyance, but the body has already passed them. Secondly, if the United States cannot honor an interim agreement negotiated in Geneva by Russia, China, France, Germany, the UK, and ourselves, we're not alone in this. It will never lift sanctions after a final agreement. Above all, they will argue the United States is not interested in nuclear diplomacy. We are interested in regime change. The bottom line, if this body passes S-1881, diplomatic negotiations will collapse and there will be no final agreement. Some might want that result, but I do not. Iran's nuclear program would once again be unrestrained, and the only remaining option to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon would be a military action. I do not want that unless it's absolutely necessary. To date, the prospect of just considering this bill has prompted Iranian legislators to consider retaliation. There's talk that the legislative branch, called the Majlis, may move to increase nuclear enrichment far beyond the 5% limit in the interim agreement and much closer to, if not achieving, weapons-grade uranium. So the authors of additional sanctions in this body and Iranian hardliners in the other body would actually combine to blow up the diplomatic effort of 6 major powers. The bill's sponsors have argued that sanctions would strengthen the United Nations' hand in negotiations. They argue that sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. They contend that additional sanctions would force Iran to abandon its nuclear program. I could not disagree more. Let me give you the views of a few other people who are knowledgeable in the arena. Dr. Paul Pillar, the former senior U.S. intelligence official and current professor at Georgetown University, recently wrote, and I quote, "It's the prospect of having U.S.-led sanctions removed that will convince Iran to accept severe restrictions on its nuclear program. Threatening Iran with additional sanctions now, after it has agreed to the interim agreement, and the interim agreement is about to go into effect, will not convince Tehran to complete a final agreement." I couldn't agree more. If this bill would help our negotiators, as is ours contend, they would say so. This bill is an egregious imposition on the executive's authority to conduct foreign affairs. In fact, our Secretary of State has formally asked this Congress to give our negotiators and our experts the time and space to do their jobs, including no new sanctions. And what does this body say, sitting here? We're not going to do that? This is a Secretary of State that's of this body, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who has been absolutely prodigious in his efforts to get this interim agreement, has gotten it, and we're going to run the risk that it's going to break apart the next 6 months when a final agreement might well be negotiated. So, if the Senate imposes its will, if we override the President's veto, and it blows up this very fragile process, some would say, too bad, what a tragedy. And we know what the Iranian reaction will be. The Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, who I happen to have known for a substantial period of time, has clearly stated what the result will be in 5 words, and it's this: the entire deal is dead. That's his direct quote. Why wouldn't we take him at his word? So far, he's been good for his word. The ambassador of our staunchest ally, the UK, warned this body not to pass more sanctions. Sir Peter Westmacott recently wrote, and I quote, "Further sanctions now would only hurt negotiations and risk eroding international support for the sanctions that have brought us this far. The time for additional measures will come if Iran reneges on the deal or negotiations fail. Now is not that time," end quote. So I deeply believe that a vote for this legislation will cause negotiations to collapse. The United States, not Iran, then becomes the party that risks fracturing the international coalition that has enabled our sanctions to succeed in the first place. And it says to the UK, China, Russia, France, and Germany that our country cannot be trusted to stand behind our diplomatic commitments. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very big statement. These allies will question whether their compliance with sanctions and the economic sacrifices they have made are for naught. Should these negotiations fall apart, the choices are few, and the most likely result, in my view, is the eventual and inevitable use of military force. And so I ask this body, is that the choice we want to make? In 6 days, the tentative agreement will go into place. We want to pass this. We don't even want to wait and see what happens. We don't want to wait to see what the IAEA finds when they're in there 24/7, 365 days a year. I think what we ought to do is concentrate on Iranian compliance with the interim agreement. On January 20th, 2014, this agreement comes into effect, 6 days from now. And over the next 6 months, the international community will be able to verify whether or not Iran is keeping its commitments to freeze its nuclear progress. If Iran fails to abide by the terms of the interim agreement, or if a final agreement cannot be negotiated, Congress can immediately consider additional sanctions. And I deeply believe that additional sanctions should only be considered once our diplomatic track has been given the opportunity to forge a final, comprehensive, and binding agreement. And this is what is most distressing. If we hadn't reached an agreement in this 6-month period, with the cooperation and leadership of the big powers of this world. That would be one thing. But the fact of the matter is we have reached agreement, and that action is just about to take place. And we're going to jaundice it. We're going to hurt it. We're likely to collapse it by passing additional sanctions now, which a President of the United States will veto with the aim of overriding that veto. How does that make any kind of common sense? It defies logic, it threatens instant reverse, and it ends what's been unprecedented diplomacy. Do we want to really take that on our shoulders? And candidly, in my view, it's a march to war. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I know the challenges Iran poses to U.S. interests around the world. I see the majority leader on the floor. Would you like me to cease for the moment? Pardon me? Just this. Okay. I said, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I know the challenges Iran poses to United States interests around the world. Its patronage of the terrorist group Hezbollah, its support for Syria's Bashar al-Assad through the Revolutionary Guard Corps are two of the most troubling. And I would hope that as a follow-through of diplomacy, we might be able to quell some of these activities. And let me acknowledge Israel's real, well-founded concerns that a nuclear-armed Iran would threaten its very existence. I don't disagree with that. I agree with it. But we're not there yet. While I recognize and share Israel's concern, we cannot let Israel determine when and where the United States goes to war. By stating that the United States should provide military support to Israel in a formal resolution should it attack Iran, I fear that's how this bill is going to be interpreted. Let me conclude. The interim agreement with Iran is strong, it is tough, and it is realistic. It represents the first significant opportunity to change a 3-decade course in Iran and an opening to improve one of our most poisonous bilateral relationships. It could open the door to a new future, which not only considers Israel's national security, but protects our own. So to preserve diplomacy, I strongly oppose the Nuclear Weapons Free Act. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Majority Leader.
I express my appreciation to the courtesy of the Senator from California. She is courteous in everything she does in life. She's a pleasure to serve with. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that 12 noon on Wednesday, January 15th, Senate proceed to the consideration of H.J. Res. 106, which we received from the House and is at the desk, that there be no amendments, motions, or points of order in order to the joint resolution. There be up to 15 minutes of debate equally divided on the joint resolution. Finding that upon the use reading back of that time, the joint resolution be read a third time, the Senate proceed to vote on passage of the joint resolution.
Is there objection to the request? Without objection.
Mr. President, I would ask now the Senate proceed to pre-morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask that now we, as the Senate, proceed to H.R. 3527.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 3527, an act to amend the Public Health Service Act to reauthorize the Poison Center national toll-free number and so forth, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask the bill to be read a third time passed. Motion reconsider be considered made laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection. I
now ask consent the Veterans Affairs Committee be discharged from further action on S. 1434, and that we now proceed to that matter.
The clerk will report.
S. 1434, a bill to designate the Junction City Community-Based Outpatient Clinic located at 715 Southwind Drive, Junction City, Kansas, as a Lieutenant General Richard J. Seitz community-based outpatient clinic.
Is there objection to the request? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be read a third time passed. Motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I am told there are two bills at the desk. I ask for their first reading separately.
The clerk will read the titles of the bill for the first time.
S-1970, a bill to provide for additional enhancements of the sexual assault prevention and response activities of the armed forces. S-1926, a bill to delay the implementation of certain provisions of the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, and so forth, and for other purposes.
I ask for second reading on both of these matters and object to both.
Objection having been heard.
Objection having been heard. The bills will be read for the second time on the next legislative day.
President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day, adjourn until tomorrow morning, January 15th at 10 a.m., that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. Journal proceedings be approved to date. The time for two leaders be reserved for use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the time until 12 noon be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees, and with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. Finally, at noon tomorrow, the Senate proceed to the consideration of H.A. Res. 106 as provided under the previous order.
Without objection.
So at about 12:15 tomorrow, there will be a roll call vote on passage of short-term continuing resolution. Tomorrow, we'll continue work on the agreement to consider the flood insurance bill and begin consideration of the omnibus appropriation bill once it's received from the House. So if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that the Senate adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Today in the Senate, members blocked an amendment to the unemployment extension bill that would extend benefits through November. Members then blocked the underlying bill that would extend long-term unemployment benefits by 3 months. It is unclear when the chamber will again take up work on this measure. Live coverage of the U.S. Senate when members return, always here on C-SPAN 2.